right. Welcome to the Bookly podcast, another solo episode. So this episode was actually supposed to be filmed with a guest, but due to some technical difficulties, we had to reschedule, and then I had already announced the books for this month, and so we ended up having to just record this one solo. I've also been out of town for a couple weeks, so you're going to have to deal with it just being me today here on the podcast. However, I am playing around with next year doing a few more solo episodes. So the biggest struggle of the Bookly podcast so far has definitely been finding guests. I thought the biggest struggle would have been reading a book a week, and I've actually read more than a book a week. I've been cruising through books. I have enjoyed it tremendously. And so the thing that has really stressed me out about the podcast has been finding guests. And so because of that, I think for 2024, I'm not going to put as big of an emphasis on finding guests, and we're going to just do solo episodes whenever I can't find somebody. Because the other feedback that I'm getting from people is that people want to read along with the podcast. And so actually today, I spent a big chunk of today outlining every single week for all of 2024. So starting January 1st through December 31st of every single book that I want to read next year and which week I'm going to read it. So I'm going to be releasing that list here shortly. I'm going to try to release it on YouTube as well as Instagram and on the website. So if you'd like to read along, follow along with the podcast, you will be able to do that, for the entire year. Because that is the feedback that I've been getting from both people that I know, as well as actually I've had a few strangers reach out to me and say, we love the idea, love what you're doing, would love to kind of read in advance some of the books that you have coming up. So I wanted to make that a priority for 2024 and not necessarily the guest. I'm still going to be reaching out and trying to find guests for every episode. And if you'd like to be a guest, you can actually now just look ahead into what books are going to be coming up this year and maybe try to schedule a time when you can come up to the podcast and record an episode with whatever book that you're looking for. So just reach out now that all the books should be released here shortly and look for, one or two books that you'd like to read, and we can go ahead and get those taken care of and get you on the schedule for the Bookly podcast. So I will be still recording episodes with guests. This is not a complete change in the format of the podcast. However, it's just not going to be the emphasis. The emphasis is going to be on reading. It's going to be on learning from books. And it's just going to be, again, on my personal progression through reading, what I gain for insights, and also just, you as the listener trying to learn what books you may want to and not make, like books that you want to read and books that you don't want to read. Maybe learn something about books that you don't really want to read, but you wish you had read, just trying to learn from the books without maybe even having to read them. I don't know what stage of life you're in. You could be in whatever stage you want. For me, for up until this year, I was in a stage where I never read at all. So I want to put more of an emphasis on people reading along with the podcast. That being said, because of that, I'm going to rely a little bit more heavily on user submitted feedback, as well as maybe, trying to get questions prior to the episodes releasing so that I can, answer user submitted questions. I am going to try, I think, eventually to get a Discord started where people who are interested in kind of being a part of the Bookly book club can talk on the Discord, chat with people, meet new people, talk about books, talk about upcoming episodes. I'll put all my announcements and everything in there. That's something that I've been kind of throwing around in the back of my head, and I'd like to get that up and running sometime in this next year. We're going to try to get a little bit more traction with the podcast first, and then we're going to be launching that. So just be kind of keeping an eye out for that. I think that should be eventually happening. I'm not giving any sort of hard, fast timelines. I'm just leaving that open for 2024. So this week's episode of the podcast is on 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. This is a dense book. So if you are somebody, who really kind of likes to think a little bit more philosophical, if you've listened to Jordan Peterson at all, you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about. He is kind of like a high level guy. I I consider myself pretty kind of mid-level. I shoot straight. I say what I mean. And I'm not really difficult to understand, in my opinion. I don't think so. And Jordan Peterson can be a little bit more difficult to understand. He's got a lot of, I don't know what to call them outside of like high level thinking. And so for me, this book was a little bit difficult to get into at first. And I've listened to a lot of podcasts with Jordan Peterson. In fact, he's one of the people that if he's on a podcast as a guest, I'll almost always listen to him. I actually prefer him as a guest more than I like his personal podcast, if that makes sense. I think he makes a very good guest because people can bounce ideas off of him, and he is very, very articulate in the way that he speaks, and he's very good at answering questions. I think he makes a very good guest. Now, there are some episodes of his podcast as well that I absolutely love. If you're interested in learning more about the episodes specifically that I've listened to that have really changed the way that I think, then reach out to me. There are definitely a couple episodes that have really made me question things, and perceptions that I had previously that, I don't know, they were really mind-blowing episodes. So he just in general is a very mind-blowing individual. And so if you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, I would maybe listen to a few episodes of his podcast or him as a guest on other people's podcasts first before diving into this book. Because I think it's important to understand, one, his background, and two, the way he talks, because he writes like he talks, which is, again, just right over my head for most of it. And then every once in a while, he'll leave like nuggets that I understand. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it now. But for most of the book, I'm just like drowning in information. And that's also kind of the way that he talks too. So it's kind of important that you familiarize yourself with that, in my opinion, because it can be a little bit much at first. So for those of you who don't know Jordan Peterson, brief overview, he is a clinical psychologist, and he's from Canada. I think now he's a member of the Daily Wire. And he is a pretty big advocate for gender roles, as well as kind of men being men. I know that kind of falls in the gender role side of things, but not just kind of in the gender identity side of things, but he's kind of more in the like men should make their beds, wake up every morning, work hard, provide for families, kind of, that mentality. And he also is an advocate for free speech, as well as kind of in the, I don't know. I mean, he's just, I guess, yeah, I would say free speech. That's the way that I would put it. And he's kind of come under fire quite a bit in the past, I would say 2 years, with everything that he said about kind of the transgender ideology with when it pertains to like early onset side of things with free speech in Canada. As far as like pronouns go, that's kind of where he got his start. As far as his fame goes, he was very anti-forced use of pronouns, preferred pronouns. And then kind of from there, he's kind of snowballed into just, I would say, just an overall kind of podcast personality. He's on a lot of people's podcasts, and he kind of, talks about a lot of the same things that are talked about in this book. So I won't really dive too deep into them because he goes over quite a bit of it in this book, and you'll kind of get an idea of who he is. And I believe this is the second book that he's written. I would not say that he is the best writer at all. You can tell that he's very good at speaking, but he writes a lot like he speaks, which is, he rambles quite a bit and he jumps from thought to thought. And I think that's why I like him so much on other people's podcasts, is because other people kind of have questions for him and reel it in and have an agenda that they would like to get through. And it kind of keeps him in line. Whereas in the book, I felt like he just had free roam to go wherever he wanted. And that was a little bit dangerous because he really does go wherever he wants. And sometimes I feel like it didn't pertain at all to the point that he was trying to make. So again, the book is called 12 Rules for Life. And so, I mean, structure-wise, it's pretty easy to follow. There are 12 rules, and he goes through each one, 1 through 12 of these rules. But within each category of rules, and I'll kind of dive into it as we get closer to those rules, he just leaves the train of thought and goes to like a completely separate point, and then it doesn't pertain anything to it, and then he'll come right back. And maybe it's just because, again, it's going over my head and he's infinitely smarter than I am, but I felt like that made this book a little bit hard to follow at points. It could have been shorter, could have been a little bit more concise, and for that reason, I actually prefer him on podcasts than the book. However, the book was great, and I do think it has a ton of important information, but listening to Jordan Peterson normally is like drinking from a fire hose. He's just constant information and like knowledge kind of pouring out of him. Listening or reading Jordan Peterson is like drinking out of 2 fire hoses that turn on and off at different points and just spray you in like the back of the head, the front of the head, the back of the head, the front of the head, because nobody is keeping him in line. He's just going the entire time. And so that's one of the things that I did not love about this book. And what made it kind of maybe not fun to read as much. Again, however, there's a ton of information in here, and it was a really good book, and it's an important book. So I don't want to downplay the importance of it, but if you're going in thinking that this is going to be a very easy book to understand and digest the thoughts and the ideas of Jordan Peterson, then this is not the book for you. I would honestly say stick with the podcasts that he is in, because those are much more digestible than this book. So I wanted to start off with each of the rules. And another thing about the rules is they all have very weird names. So I did not come up with these names when I talk about them. So don't think, oh, Brandon is putting his own spin on the 12 rules from Jordan Peterson. These are the actual names that he came up with for the rules. And so it's not my fault that they're confusing. It's his fault. So rule number 1 for rules for life. Before we actually even start that, he talks about at the very beginning of the book where these rules came from. So it actually came from, I believe, a Reddit thread, or maybe it was even pre-Reddit. It may have been it was a Quora thread. So anybody who knows what Quora is, it's like a question and answering website. Most people use it for homework, I think is the only thing I've ever used it for. Well, you type in your question that you have on your textbook, and usually somebody has answered that exact same question, kind of like Quizlet. Another thing is Quora. So he talks about being on Quora quite a bit and answering people's questions and becoming like a preferred contributor to Quora early on in his, kind of before he became famous. And he really enjoyed answering those questions. And one of the questions that he responded to, I don't know exactly what that question was, but he talks about how it developed into these rules to be successful and to have a happy life. And he started outlining these rules there, and kind of lightly expounding on these rules, and then decided that he'd like to take these rules that he came up with on this Quora thread and turn it into a book. So that's where this whole idea came from for him. And he, again, so that's what it is. It's just 12 rules that he came up with on an internet thread, and then he's expounded upon them in this book. So the first rule that he came up with is stand up straight with your shoulders back. So that's the name of the rule. If you have ever heard anything about lobsters and Jordan Peterson together, this is where it comes from. I believe this is probably one of his more famous criticisms that come after him. And people are always like, if you read any of the comments on Goodreads or anything about Jordan Peterson or any of the reviews on YouTube, people are always like, oh, lobsters, humans, what do they have to do together? This is so dumb. He's an idiot. He's comparing people to lobsters, and he is in this section, but not in the way that you may think. So the idea behind the lobsters is that lobsters, like male lobsters, fight, and I may be getting this all completely wrong. And I'm going to preface this whole episode of the podcast is I'm doing my absolute best to understand each of these principles. And so I'm just trying to pass the highlights of what I got from this book to you. If you've read this book and you're like, man, Brandon didn't get anything right from this book, it's because, again, he operates on a completely different plain from me, as well in, in relation to the way that he thinks. And so I'm doing my absolute best here, but I did want to kind of outline the key topics of what I got out of each of these rules, so that, maybe if you want to hear from the horse's mouth exactly what these rules mean and maybe get your own little nuggets or wisdom from each of these rules, go ahead and read the book. But ultimately, the first one is that male lobsters fight. And when a lobster loses, it kind of adopts almost like a loser mentality. And so there have been scientific studies that have been done where essentially they take a lobster that has lost its first fight, and it is exponentially more likely to continue to lose fights between two male lobsters because it kind of views itself as a loser. So so you have two lobsters, one wins, one loses. The winner lobster is more likely to win its next fight than the loser lobster. And that compounds continuously. So loser lobsters will lose their first fight, more likely to lose their second, more likely even to lose their third. And they basically adopt the persona of lobsters regardless of physical capabilities and physical traits. Whereas the reverse is also true in that if one lobster wins its first fight, it is more likely to win its second fight regardless of physical attributes. So that's the comparison that Jordan Peterson makes with people. And so again, the title of the first rule is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And it is kind of the perception that you give off has a greater effect than you think. So if you're somebody who slouches or perceives slouches, speaks quietly, isn't assertive, isn't sure of yourself, then that will only continue to compound throughout your life. And it's kind of like almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The lobsters who lose view themselves as losers, so they continue to lose. People who are kind of view themselves as quiet, view themselves as reserved, view themselves as, any of these less desirable qualities, then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They are what they view themselves as, and they are the way that they act. Whereas the flip side may be also true. If you, like he says, stand up straight with your shoulders back and give off the kind of personality and view yourselves as somebody who is successful, it actually is self-fulfilling in that it will make you more successful. Now, it isn't always 100%, and he talks about that as well. There are lobsters who win their first fight and then go on to lose their second fight. However, it's just a slight advantage that over time compounds and compounds and compounds. So that's kind of the first lesson. The other thing is on the flip side with kind of that inward reflection, that lobsters also size other lobsters up and judge and fight. So like fight loser lobsters more because they kind of view that self kind of reflection of loser lobsters. Again, I don't know if I'm really the best at explaining this, but they can kind of see the countenance of those lobsters that have lost the fights, view themselves as loser lobsters. They look like loser lobsters because, again, maybe they slouch and they don't lift their claws as high as they should. And so other successful lobsters will see that, and they will continue to fight that lobster knowing that they will win. So the same thing is also true that people who slouch and people who, don't believe in themselves, not only is that kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but other people can see that in them as well. And then they will reinforce that image. And it's not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but other people are also going to reinforce that image of yourself. So it's important that you kind of give off that different kind of view of yourself and create the self-fulfilling loop of success instead of the self-fulfilling loop of defeat. And that's ultimately the kind of the crux of that argument, is that people create self-fulfilling loops that will always continue to come true based on their views of themselves. And that in order to kind of break the cycle, you have to change the way that you physically appear as well as the way that you see yourself. So it's kind of twofold. You can't just believe in yourself, but then, continue to kind of cower in the corner and give off those, I hate this word with all of my heart, but those vibes of being a loser lobster. You have to, be confident and believe in yourself, and also look confident and believe in yourself. So, let me see here. I did get some quotes here from this one. All right, so for this one, the quote that I pulled is, "People, like lobsters, size each other up, partly in consequence of stance. If you present yourself as defeated, then people will react to you as if you are losing. If you start to straighten up, then people will look and treat you differently." So that's the first rule for life is stand up with your shoulders back. Rule number 2, treat yourself like somebody you are responsible for helping. So all right, let me repeat that one because I think I inflected in the wrong parts. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. So I kind of laughed at this one quite a bit because the first example that he gives in the book for this rule, he talks about somebody being prescribed an antibiotic and they'll take the antibiotic for 1 to 2 days and then they'll stop taking the antibiotic. On the flip side, the same person will go to the vet and get medicine for their dog and make sure that the dog takes the medicine from start to finish instead of, stopping 2 to 3 days in. And he says, and he kind of reflects on that. He says, are people more likely to finish medications for other people and medications for, their pets instead of, making sure that they themselves finish their medications? They don't value or treat themselves to the same standard that they treat others. And I laughed at this because if my wife is listening to this episode, she will have a huge smile on her face and be like, that is you to a T. I never finished my antibiotics, and I know that that's terrible. And apparently it does all sorts of things to your gut. It makes you resistant to antibiotics. I know there's I'm not going to go into that because that's not what this episode is about, but this is me to a T. Whereas my dog, I would literally give my life for. And so when reading this, it kind of made me think a little bit about that. So he says here in a quote, treat yourself as if you were someone responsible for helping instead to consider, I can't read. To treat yourself as if you were someone you are responsible for helping is instead to consider what will be truly good for you. It is not what you want. It is also not what makes you happy. So he talks here about the difference between what you want, what is happy, what makes you happy, and then also what is good for you. So, and he kind of puts at the top of the list what is good for you. So sometimes all three of those things are the same, but sometimes they're not. And he says it is important that we differentiate those things and focus on the things that are good for us. He also then kind of in this chapter talks about responsibility and taking responsibility for your actions. Again, this is where I tend to think he goes off on tangents and could kind of focus a little bit more solely on the idea at hand instead of, adding, 10 different ideas to one of the rules. But this is the one where he kind of focuses in on responsibility as well, taking responsibility for your actions. It's a pretty common theme throughout all of the rules, but it's especially prevalent in this rule too. Taking responsibility for not only yourself, but also for others. And then, at the end of the chapter, he leaves a nice little kind of nugget here. And he says, you need to consider the future and think what my life might look like if I were caring for myself properly. I think that's a good self-reflection to add at the end of this chapter. What would your life look like if you were doing everything that you needed to make sure that you were taken care of properly? And again, that doesn't mean I hate kind of that whole focus on me time and, focusing on myself, me. And, I don't even know what that word is or what that kind of idea is, but it's that self-care stuff. I think that that's good to to a point, but I think that the self-care movement has also kind of spun out of control a little bit to where like self-care now is not just about doing things that are good for you. It's kind of fallen into the trap that he talked about earlier. It's like doing the things that you want and doing the things that make you happy over the things that are good for you. Like self-care isn't self-isolation and just making yourself happy. Self-care, should be, again, doing the things that are good for you. And so that whole self-care movement, I have a slight problem with it. And again, I don't want to sound like a meanie, but I do think that that's kind of spun out of control now. Like you've seen on the internet, I don't know if you've seen any of these reels or anything, but I see them every once in a while where people will have weddings to themselves. It's weird, but it's a new thing where people are like marrying themselves and they're putting them like there is no bride or groom. It's just themselves, and they are kind of putting themselves first and making it all about them. And that to me, they're labeling it all under self-care. Like this is self-care. This is self-love. Like this is the way that I should look. The body positivity movement is another great example. It falls under self-love, self-care, when in actuality, you're kind of sacrificing the good and you're focusing on the things that would make you happier, the things that you want. And you're kind of lumping those into this idea and this rule, when in actuality, it goes in complete contradiction to this rule. And so I think that's a good distinction to make. Like it's important to take a step back and to think like, okay, is this just something I want, just something that's good, or just something that will make me happy? Or is this something that is actually good for me? And again, sometimes all three of those things can be true at once, but a lot of times nowadays, like if you look on Instagram and you look on YouTube and all these things, it's not always true. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because I think this rule is very important, but it is also kind of a slippery slope that a lot of people fall into, and they just justify anything they want with, oh, I'm just, I'm treating myself like I'm responsible for helping, because this is the way that I would want to be helped. I want people to affirm my, unhealthy habits. And that's not true. Like you don't want to just affirm unhealthy habits. You want to treat yourself like somebody you are responsible for helping do good, like not just somebody you're responsible for helping to be happy. So I hope that made sense. But yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make, because he makes that distinction in the book. I don't think it's as clear in the book. He doesn't really dive into kind of the body positivity movement or any of these other like self-love movements, but I think it's a very popular movement and a very popular idea nowadays. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two things. Like they are very different, and it's important. I mean, there is some overlap, but don't be fooled by don't be fooled by the wolf in sheep's clothing. Like self-help and self-love can sometimes be to the detriment of the good. So just make sure that you're kind of doing a real good analysis of that before you really start diving into that. So rule number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you. So this one was an interesting rule for me. So basically he talks about how we become the average of the people that we hang around, and that we shouldn't hang around with people who bring us down. And it was interesting because, you kind of always have this internal dilemma going on in your life. Like you want to hang around with people that lift you up and bring you up and aspire you for greatness. And which is why you want to hang out with people who maybe do the things that you wish that you could do. So if you want to be entrepreneurial, you want to hang out with people who, are working on entrepreneurial endeavors and maybe have had successes in the past. If you want to be athletic, the same thing is true. You want to hang out with people who are slightly ahead of you in those athletic endeavors. I think that comes from Outliers as well. He talks about how, anybody who can put themselves with better players early are more likely to become professionals. And, that's basically what Jordan Peterson is saying here, is that you want to surround yourselves with people that are going to help lift you up, because you become the average of the people that you hang around. Now, on the flip side of that, you also have the idea of wanting to help people who maybe have it worse off than you. And So this is where it gets kind of hard because he doesn't really address that a whole lot in this book. He talks more about kind of the positive aspects of your personal growth and not associating with people who drag you down. And he talks a lot, like a direct quote from the book is, down is a lot easier than up. And so, he warns against hanging around people who, drag you down and who are constantly doing the things that you are trying to maybe recover from. So, for instance, if you're somebody who's trying to get your life together, maybe, you come from a family that, hasn't been as fortunate, and a family who doesn't, maybe has never gone to college, for instance. And if you constantly hang around kids who aren't going to college, then it's really hard to be the one kid who does go to college. Instead, he says, you want to hang around kids who also aspire to go to college, because then it's easier for you to go to college, because it's a lot easier to get drugged down than it is to move up while other people are not moving up around you. So that becomes a little bit hard, because you also don't want to abandon people who, have the potential to move up too. Like where do you draw that line? And this was kind of the hard part for me in this chapter, is where do you draw the line of the people that you hang out with and the people that you want to help become better, again, because you don't want to be the very bottom of that friend group, but you also don't want, or that group of associates, you don't want to be the very bottom, the guy that's dragging people down, but you also don't want to be the very top person who's getting drugged down. And so I would say, I was reading online about this and kind of where other people draw the line, and how other people kind of deal with this internal dilemma of who to associate with and who to really invest your time with. Because ultimately you're investing your time with people who are either lifting you up, or you're investing your time trying to lift other people up. You're doing one or the other pretty much always. And the thing that somebody said online that I really liked was, they said that it really comes down to whether or not you are assisting somebody lift themselves up, or whether you're trying to lift somebody up. And all progression has to come from within first, meaning that you have to have that personal desire first to want to whatever that it progress. You can't drag somebody who does not want to progress up. So that's kind of where this person online was kind of drawing the line. He says, I am more than willing to be the person who helps people and assists them in progressing. But you can't just be the person that is pulling people up the entire time. So I thought that was kind of a neat way to look at it. That, you don't want to you don't want to completely disassociate yourself with people who are, struggling, but you don't want to only associate with people who are struggling and with no desire to be better. If people are struggling and have a desire to be better, definitely work with them and help them. You just don't want to get trapped in kind of this saving mentality, that kind of classic trope of, the girl who wants to, who wants to save her, deadbeat boyfriend and all, it's in every Hallmark movie or whatever. Not Hallmark movie. Hallmark movies are just two happy people always. No, it's in every CW show, basically. Every CW show has this complete loser, and this girlfriend comes in, and she's going to be the saving grace for this person, and she pulls this person out of complete misery, single-handedly, because she's gorgeous, and then she's also, got this amazing personality, and it makes up for the both of them, and they end up living happily ever after. That doesn't happen. Instead, what you need to have is somebody who maybe is struggling, but has the desire and is working hard at it themselves. And then you can be the person that helps them along that journey of becoming better. But it starts with themselves first. Again, you don't want to get caught up in the I can save them all by myself mentality. That just is not true. Here are a couple quotes from that section. He says, here's something to consider. If you have a friend whose friendship you wouldn't recommend to your sister or your father or your son, why would you have such a friend yourself? Pretty harsh, but I mean, it's kind of true. An interesting way of kind of evaluating, again, who you spend your time with and kind of what that does to your overall progression as a human. And then lastly, I really like this here at the end of that chapter. He says, don't think that it is easier to surround yourself with good, healthy people than bad, unhealthy people. It is not. A good, unhealthy person isn't ideal. It requires strength and daring to stand up near to such a person. Have some humility, have some courage. I thought that was interesting because, thinking about it initially, I was like, oh yeah, it makes sense. I just want to hang out with good people who, are successful and who lift me up all the time. That should be easy. Like, I would want to stand next to one of those people. But I do kind of see how that can be difficult. There's kind of that imposter syndrome. There's that, I'm not, I don't feel qualified. These are kind of, easy ways that people rationalize not surrounding themselves with these kind of people. Like, I don't run in the same circle as them. Oh, they're too good for me. These are easy ways of kind of copping out of doing exactly that, of surrounding yourself with the people that you want to. Like, it does take courage and it does take humility to say like, oh, I'm not good enough to be surrounded by these people, but I'm going to do it anyway because I know that they're going to lift me up. So I think that was really, kind of a good self-reflective idea when trying to think of who you can surround yourself with. All right. So that was number 3. We are slowly going through these, so we may need to pick these up just a little bit. I don't want this episode to be ridiculously long. All right, so number 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not who someone else is today. Pretty straightforward. Again, this is a tried and true rule. I have been preaching this forever. This is one thing that I wholeheartedly believe in. I think comparison can be the death of happiness, and I think that is true when you're comparing yourself to other people. And I do think that there is, some people do have the ability to compare themselves to others in a healthy way, kind of in like more of a motivational way. Like, you can compare yourself to other athletes and try to be more in an aspirational way. However, I would say that more often than not, comparison to others eventually leads towards just any sort of unhappiness in general. It is way more beneficial to compare yourself to who you were yesterday and then continue to build upon that. And at one point in the book, or at one point in this rule, he talks about kind of the 1% rule, meaning that if you were to just improve yourself 1% every single day or 1% every single week, that because of the idea of compounding interest, if you continually improve yourself 1%, 1%, 1%, that you would be, a completely different person come 1 year. You would be, well over 100% better as an individual if you just continually improve yourself. Even at, 1% weekly, it's more than 52%, because 1% every single week is going to end up being like, I don't know, like 75, 80% better of an individual. And then by year 2, you're, 200% better of an individual. And so it's important to kind of compare yourself and then make micro changes instead of compare yourself to somebody who's maybe already, leaps and bounds ahead of you in whatever goal that you may have. And then try to just catch up in one giant leap and bound. That's just unrealistic. You're not going to be able to catch up to somebody in one giant leap and bound. However, with incremental steps done regularly and consistently, you can, improve to whatever potential that you want. And I think that that's important because incremental steps are, again, they're easy to accomplish because they're small, but they add up to be a lot. And that's ultimately what he talks about in this chapter. And he also talks a little bit about, one second, let me read this. He also talks about like what it is important to focus on in this chapter. So, he talks about how, he says, the better ambitions to have, The better ambitions to have do with the development of character and ability rather than status and power. Status and power you can lose. Your character will go with you wherever you carry your character with you wherever you go, and it allows you to prevail against adversity. So he talks about kind of focusing on character and ability first rather than status and power, and then kind of focusing in on those things. At one point, he talks about how you only see what you aim for. So if you're constantly focusing on power and ability, then you're kind of not seeing the rest of everything because you're, focused in on just the one thing, and kind of goals and everything just don't really have like that much of a peripheral vision, I would say. I think that's kind of the way that he talks about it. It's very like horse blinder mentality when you're, hyper focused on something. So if you're going to hyper focus on anything, make sure that you're hyper focusing on the things that really matter. Ultimately is what he talks about here. This next chapter, chapter 5, was very interesting. This, I think, is one of the more controversial. I think there are 2 to 3 controversial topics here in this book, and I think this is one of them. This rule is do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Kind of a harsh chapter, and especially having 2 kids, one of them being 3 and the other one being less than a year. It is impossible to do anything that makes your kids not dislike them at some point or another, even just momentarily. Kids are just frustrating individuals, and even the best of kids, which I have the best kids in the world, can be frustrating. My kids woke up last night, I think 3 or 4 times, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, it is very hard to not dislike them when they are screaming. So this was a little bit of an interesting chapter. I've said that so far with every chapter, and it's because it's an interesting book. But this book is all about basically parenting, and I think he tries to come up with kind of the reason that kids suck nowadays, and why this generation is just absolutely terrible and doesn't listen and is rude. And I think you can partially blame that on social media, and you can partially blame that on the internet and technology, and the ability for kids to compare themselves to a million different people instead of just grow up with friends that live just within their neighborhood. I think there's a lot of reasons why kids nowadays seem more unlikable than ever. However, he tries to kind of distill that down and how to avoid that as a parent. And really what it comes down to is like parenting with clear boundaries. Like being a parent over a friend is the essence of this chapter. So he talks about this, and he says, more often than not, modern parents are simply paralyzed by the fear that they will no longer be liked or even loved by their children if they chastise them for any reason. They want their children's friendship above all and are willing to sacrifice respect to get it. This is not good. A child will have many friends, but only 2 parents, if that. Parents are more, not less than friends. I thought that was really, really cool. Again, it goes to show kind of the impact that parents can have in a child's life and the importance of being good parents in this modern society. I think people don't take the role of parents as seriously as they did, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think, in my opinion, parenting is the most challenging thing I've ever done, the most rewarding thing I've done, but by leaps and bounds, miles, it is the most important thing I have ever done. And I think that more parents need that perspective. It is the most important thing that you will ever do, is kind of raising and developing these children that are going to, have these consequences for the rest of their life. So it is, yeah, it's important. He says here that the primary duty of parents is to make their children socially desirable. He talks about how kids should be, raised with clear sets of boundaries that, help integrate them into society, help them learn the rules of society, and help them ultimately become desirable individuals to socialize with, because, as they become desirable and as they learn to follow rules and learn to be respectful, other people will like to associate with them, and those associations will then basically compound their ability to learn and their centers of influence and their future opportunities moving forward. And that is the primary role of parents. The primary role of parents is not to protect your children or to even, make sure that there are no challenges, or to, again, be friends. He emphasizes that quite a bit. The primary role is to help provide opportunities for your children to succeed. Another quote here, I have a lot of quotes from this section because I found it fascinating, was, given this, the fundamental moral question is not how to shelter children completely from their misadventures and failures so that they never experience any fear or pain, but how to maximize their learning so that useful information and knowledge may be gained with minimal cost. So again, it's not about sheltering your kids. It's not about being friends with your kids. It's about helping your kids become and develop into, people that other people want to hang out with. And I think that that's kind of the point of the name of this rule. It's don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I think it's not about what you disliking them. I think a more proper name for this is don't let your children do anything that makes others dislike them. Because as a parent, you're going to love your children, hopefully, no matter what. But ultimately, you want to make them desirable to be around and provide an opportunity for them to learn and grow and become the best versions of themselves, so that other people also desire to be around them, learn and grow, and they become kind of an integral part of society. And so that is one of these rules here. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at parenting. And it definitely made me kind of evaluate what is important. I think, it goes pretty hand in hand with a lot of the topics that were talked about in Outliers. Recently read that one. However, I think it's a little bit more direct than Outliers. Outliers talks a little bit about, making sure that your children, talk to adults and that they have the opportunity to grow and that they, are sociable. And as they're more sociable, then, they will, continue to develop social skills, and that they'll continue to, talk to people with authority, and, then they'll develop authority. And that's kind of the pathway that Malcolm Gladwell takes with Outliers. And then Jordan Peterson basically is just blunt about it. He's like, just don't make your kids brats, and make sure that they also talk to people, and that you are responsible 100% for making sure that they become likable members of society, because as they become likable, they will have more opportunities given to them, just like Malcolm Gladwell said, in a much more kind of nice, politically correct way. So that was that rule. The next rule, I believe this is, sorry, I didn't number these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so this is rule 6, halfway through. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. So this one is pretty straightforward. Again, it is important that you kind of reflect inward and take care of your own personal issues before you start, pointing out the issues of others. More often than not, people are easy to criticize others while, they have a lot going on in their lives, when in actuality, much more effort would be, saved if they were to just kind of work on themselves a little bit and be a little bit less judgmental of others. I think more people will find out more people will find out that they can be, again, a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more forgiving, and a little bit more understanding of others the more you work on yourself and you realize how hard it is to fix things in your own life. And then maybe, you don't have to worry so much what other people got going on in their lives, because it's difficult to, that road to self-betterment is a difficult road. And so as you work on yourself, you realize, oh crap, the person across the street might also be working on themselves. It's just hard, we're all in this together. It's just hard to be better. And so don't criticize people. And I think that's something that you'll learn if you're working on yourselves. It's also important to just, reflect on your own kind of life periodically, and to just again, have that self-reflection and that ability to, see what is going on in your life that maybe you would like to fix. One of the things that he says here that I really liked that I had never heard before. Well, actually, I don't know if I had ever heard before, but it was a good, it was a good reminder if I had heard it before. He says, consider as well that you may be blocked in your progress, not because of the lack of opportunity, but because you have been too arrogant to make full use of what already lies in front of you. So I thought that was good. Again, I'm not entirely sure what that has to do with this rule, but it was a cool little nugget in this rule. So again, he's all over the place in all these rules. So just kind of talks about whatever he wants, then puts a label in front of it. Rule 7, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. We're going to kind of brush through this one pretty quickly because it's pretty self-explanatory. It's important to pursue, again, the things that are going to have the biggest impact in your life, not necessarily the things that come the quickest. And again, sometimes those things are the same thing, but more often than not, things that are meaningful are hard, and that's what makes them meaningful. I think next year I'm going to read a book. I can't remember what it's called, but it's something about the struggle is the opportunity or whatever. I don't know what it is, but it's basically saying just that. Like, the hard things are the important things, not the easy things. So we'll read a whole book about that maybe next year. Throughout the entire book, Jordan Peterson does compare, basically does use the Bible quite a bit in, evidence for a lot of these rules. He is a very religious person, and he uses, the Bible as kind of like I would say kind of the text that is religious, but also kind of philosophical in a way. He uses it as a way for basically the writers of the Bible to prove out human nature and the way that they viewed success and the rules that they wished to impart upon their kids through the lessons that they learned in the Bible. And so he talks about how a lot of these rules have been passed down from the earliest times through the Bible, and that we're just basically rediscovering these rules now, and that they have always existed. These are basically the essence of successful individuals and the essence of, successful societies throughout time. So one of the things that I found really interesting in this pursue what is meaningful that he talks about is when Christ is fasting for 40 days and 40 nights in the New Testament, and he is tempted by the devil to basically make some bread. And his response is, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth from the mouth of God. And Jordan Peterson says, what does this answer mean? It means that even under conditions of extreme privation, there are more important things than food. To put it another way, bread is of little use to a man who has betrayed his soul. So he basically is reiterating his point that there are things that are more meaningful. Always. There's basically a hierarchy of meaningfulness, and that we should choose the most meaningful thing. And in this instance, in the Bible, it teaches that, bread is of little use to someone who's betrayed his soul, meaning that Christ was pursuing something ultimately meaningful, although he was passing up on something that was expedient. And this was a great example of that. So I thought it was interesting. It was a cool way to look at this passage of the Bible. So rule number 8 was tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Kind of an interesting caveat to telling the truth. And he talks about obviously lying to others, but he also talks about lying to yourself and being honest with kind of your own views and your own life. He says, if your life is not what it could be, try telling the truth. If you cling desperately to an ideology or wallow in nihilism, try telling the truth. If you are weak and rejected and desperate and confused, try telling the truth. In paradise, everyone speaks the truth. That's what makes it paradise. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. So again, he talks about telling the truth not lying to other people, in that, it kind of builds trust, and he talks about the benefits of, not lying to others and everything like that. But ultimately the bulk of this chapter is kind of focused on not lying to yourself. And that if you are at all miserable with any portions of your life, take an honest look at yourself, take an honest look at what you believe in, take an honest look at what it is that you desire, and then don't lie to yourself. Like, be honest. Is this the way that you think? Is this true? Is this, whatever it is, just take an honest look at it, and, try not to rationalize the bad with, lies and deceptions. So I thought that was a pretty good chapter. Rule number, I believe it's 9. Assume that the 9, 10, 11, 12. Yep, 9. Assume the person you are listening to might know something yet you don't. Again, a pretty easy to understand rule. I think that kind of piggybacked a lot off of the rule that was set your house in perfect order before you criticize others or criticize the world. I think it's important that, a lot of these things piggyback off of each other's, but in this one, instead of talking about the things that the two rules had in common, the major difference that I got between the two rules was kind of listening as a active skill. And he talks a lot about listening being really important and kind of a lost skill in society. He says that, he quotes Carl Rogers, and he says, the great majority of us cannot listen. We find ourselves compelled to evaluate because listening is too dangerous. The first requirement is courage, and we do not always have it. I thought that was interesting because a lot of times I am in the same boat. I don't know that I always listen. I find myself evaluating always. I'm listening, but I'm listening with my own agenda. I'm trying to kind of basically confirm my own biases, or maybe disprove other people based on exactly what they're saying. And I'm just constantly coming up with, yes, I agree with that. No, I don't agree with that. This is why I don't agree with it. Yes, no, yes, no. And evaluating like, oh, is this person knowledgeable? No. Is this person, and then devaluating what they're saying, or, valuating, or, overvaluating what they're saying based on maybe my own preconceived biases. And really, what we should be doing the entire time is just listening as a whole, and trying to understand what it is that they're saying first. And if we can listen and understand from their perspective what they're saying first, then we can go through and then bounce that off of our own preconceived, or our own ideas and our own already conceived judgments, and then decide whether or not we want to add that or subtract that from our current set of values. But that's not always true. Again, that takes courage. That takes courage in your own ideas and your own values to be able to do that, because you have to really know that what you believe is 100% true, or you have to have the courage to say, if proved wrong, I will, do X, Y, and Z and act accordingly. Most people don't do that. Most people have their ideas, and they're just constantly either devaluing or overvaluing what people are saying, whether or not it matches up with their ideals as they're listening to somebody. And it's not even really listening. Again, you're not trying to understand. You're not listening with the intent to grow. You're basically listening to either discredit or confirm your already developed ideas. And that's dangerous, in my opinion. I think that's just, again, that's where people start to, develop into these echo chambers, and people, then again, it's not good. I think communication is basically at an all-time low. Maybe not at an all-time low. I hate that phrase, because obviously communication during like World War II was not great. Communication during like any other genocides throughout history was also not great. So I wouldn't say that communication is at an all-time low, but it's definitely at a low in my lifetime. I mean, people just don't communicate the way that they do. They're not trying to honestly understand and empathize with the people that they're communicating with. People just don't listen. They're evaluating as they're listening. And I think it's important that we don't do that. Like there are people out there that are smarter than us. Always. There's always going to be somebody out there that's smarter than you, and maybe not smarter than you in every subject, but maybe they know something that you just don't. And they don't even have to be smarter than you. Let's be honest. They might just have a piece of information that you're not privy to. They could be super dumb and not have a piece of information and just not have a piece of information that you're privy to. So it's important that you just go into every conversation assuming that the person that you're talking to may know something that you don't. I think that's a good reminder. Rule number 10, be precise in your speech. So this one is kind of his, I would say, if I had to boil this down, this was his marriage advice chapter. So he talks a lot about communication between married couples, communication between family members in this chapter, and how ultimately all unhappiness can be boiled down to, first, people not being precise in their speech, and how sometimes it can be hurtful or it can be uncomfortable to be precise in your speech early on in a relationship. Long term, being not being precise in your speech or not being vocal in your opinions will basically always lead to disaster. Whereas, temporary discomfort early on could solve, major problems down the road. And then as you communicate precisely and people understand your opinion and then you understand other people's opinions and other people's emotions and everything like that, if people can communicate precisely, it allows for people to do good and to make changes. But if you don't know where you're going, it's impossible to make those changes. So he talks a lot about random wandering in this chapter. He says, random wandering will not move forward, and it will instead disappoint and frustrate you and make you anxious and unhappy and hard to get along with. So I think it's important. I really like the last section of that quote. It says, it will instead disappoint and frustrate you and make you anxious and unhappy and hard to get along with. I think that those are things that a lot of people struggle with nowadays, basically anxiety, unhappiness, and just a general, hard to get along with. People don't like getting along with you. I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. And I wonder if basically being more upfront in your speech and more honest and telling people the way that you really feel would solve any of that. And I don't mean over the internet. So that is one thing that he doesn't talk about in this chapter that I think is really important, is that this is not be precise in your speech on the internet and be a troll and just be mean and just tell people that they're fat and ugly and losers online. What it means is be precise in your speech face to face with people. Tell people how you really feel that are around you and communicate with them. Because I think most people would be surprised at how people react to somebody being upfront with them. My wife is a very direct and upfront individual. Anybody who knows her knows that she does speak her mind, and she's really good at it. And it's one of the traits that I really, really admire about her. And also I know that a lot of other people really admire it about her as well. I've heard a lot of people basically say that same exact thing. Hey, Olivia, you speak your mind, and I admire that. And that you're very, she tells people what she thinks, and she's not afraid of that. And I think that that's really, really important, because it hasn't devalued any of her friendships, and it hasn't devalued my opinion of her whatsoever. In fact, it's only ever kind of strengthened our relationship and strengthened her relationship with other people, because they know exactly where she stands and what her feelings are on something. It also, helps people understand kind of where she stands on certain opinions. Like just in general, I think it's a very, very good thing to do. And she's a very good example of that. So I would, again, I stand by that rule. This next rule, rule number 11, was a very interesting name. It is, do not bother children while they are skateboarding. If I had to give you 10 seconds to guess what that rule would be about, I bet you'd get it wrong. Because it's just a weird name. I didn't understand why he named it this one. I mean, I kind of get it now after going through the whole thing, but it's not, I don't know. It's very interesting. This is rule 11. This is the most controversial part of this book. And I don't understand why he lumps all of this into this rule, because ultimately what this rule means, and we'll kind of go over it real quick, and then I'll tell you why this rule was controversial, is basically that it's important that kids do dangerous things, because that's how people progress. I'm just going to read a couple quotes because I think that's going to best help you understand what this section was about. It says, of course it was dangerous. Danger was the point. They wanted to triumph over danger. They would have been safer in protective equipment, but that would have ruined it. They weren't trying to be safe. They were trying to become competent, and it's competence that makes people as safe as they can truly be. All right, end quote. And then here's another one. Even if it were possible to permanently banish everything threatening, everything dangerous, and therefore everything challenging and interesting, that would mean only that another danger would emerge. That of permanent human infantilism, I don't know, it's a hard word, and absolute uselessness. How would the nature of man ever reach its full potential without challenge and danger? Again, new quote, to interfere with a child's willingness to take necessary risks is not love or empathy, but cowardice on the part of parents. So again, that's the best way that I could possibly sum up this rule. It's basically that danger and risk are important aspects of growth. And so don't bother children while they're skateboarding is a way of saying, like, let your let kids be risky. Let them learn from their mistakes. Let them kind of push the envelope, because pushing the envelope is how they progress, because eventually if they keep pushing the envelope, they're going to get to a point where they're competent at there, and they're going to be able to push it further. And then they're going to, get to a point where they're competent even further, and then they're going to keep pushing it further. And the only way to continue to grow is to get right to the edge and then get comfortable at the edge, and then the edge moves, and then you keep moving forward. So that's kind of one aspect of it. The other aspect is that if you don't ever overcome challenging things or ever have hardships or even injuries in general, then you don't understand what it's like to overcome them. And the joy and the challenge of life is really that of overcoming danger and challenges. So that's kind of the aspect of this rule. Really cool rule. 100% agree with it. It's one of those things that as a parent, I feel like I can see myself struggling with. I don't want my kids to get hurt. Like, you just don't. You don't ever want them to get hurt. But you also don't want to limit their potential. And so you want them to get all the way up to the edge of their ability. And sometimes they fall. But if you don't ever let them get to the edge of their ability, then they can't ever get comfortable there and then push that edge further and further and further. So that's just something that I'm going to have to deal with, because it scares me, and it scares all parents who love their kids, I think. But it's the only way to allow your kids to reach their full potential. So that was kind of the core of this rule. And you might be thinking, why is that controversial? That makes sense. So in this rule, he also goes on like a super long rant, like a really long rant about gender roles and how boys need to be competitive with boys, and how girls girls like boys who are competitive and who are manly, and boys need to try to be more manly and, more bigger, faster, stronger, and all those kinds of things. And honestly, I thought it was completely unnecessary to this part of the book. Now, I understand his point that he makes there. I do agree that men are becoming soft, and that it's important that men do manly things. And I 100% agree with that. And people may not agree with me, but I do think that that's an important role for men, and that men and women have different roles within society, and they're both important, and that there cannot be a society without one or without the other. However, completely unnecessary part of this book. I think he felt like that's such a core and pivotal part of his identity and his focus when he podcasts, and focus with kind of all of his teachings, that he had to put it somewhere in his book. He couldn't just leave it out. And so he found a part that he felt like he could throw all of that in, and he just stuck it in there. Didn't belong, didn't flow well, shouldn't have been there. Honestly, he should have just taken it all out and written a completely separate book about kind of the role of, nature and humans, but he didn't. He threw it all into this chapter that honestly didn't feel it wasn't easy to follow because of that. And that's why I felt like this chapter could have been so good, because I love the idea of don't bother children while they're skateboarding, but I just didn't love the way that he threw it all in there. And that's also probably the biggest controversy of this book. There are a lot of people who read this book and are like, loved it until chapter 11, throw it all out. This thing's completely garbage. Whereas, again, you don't want to hide from your values and your ideals, but maybe add that into a separate book, because everything else that was in this book was, pretty straightforward and easy to follow, especially no matter what way you line up politically or ideologically or whatever. It was pretty easy to follow. And I just felt like the nature of humans wasn't necessarily a rule. It was just thrown in there for no reason. So again, I don't know why he did that. Didn't love that section. Again, it's not because I don't agree with him on a lot of those points, but it's because it just didn't feel fluent. It didn't feel fluid throughout this whole thing. So the last rule here that he talks about is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. Also, I don't know if he was just at the end of his book and just rambling. I don't know. He then goes on to talk about for a while about why he likes dogs more than he likes cats. And it has nothing to do with the book. I don't understand any of this. And he then goes on to talk about why he chose cats over dogs. Has nothing to do with the rule. Ultimately, this rule, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street, has to do with happiness is found in the struggle. So take some time to stop and think, and just focus on the beauty around you. Ultimately is what that rule means. Take time out of your busy day to stop and just not focus on the thing, on everything that you have to do, and just enjoy the moment. So a quote from this is, and maybe when you are going for a walk and your head is spinning, a cat will show up. And if you pay attention to it, you will get a reminder for just 15 seconds that the wonder of being might make up for the ineradicable suffering that accompanies it. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. So ultimately what he's just saying is take a couple seconds to be present in kind of your ever wondrous journey that is life. And he basically muddles that down with why dogs are better than cats and why he likes dogs and who his dogs were growing. I don't know. It was a weird chapter. Honestly, the last two chapters I felt like are super important lessons, but were completely ruined by his inability to focus on the topic at hand. And it kind of frustrated me at the end. And I felt like structurally it could have just been a little bit better and a little bit cleaner had they just been clean, tidy rules that were easy to follow and kind of focused on the core values again, instead of just going from point A to point Z to point F to point G to point be, like just move along and be a little bit more consistent in kind of the way that you present your ideas. So that was my biggest gripe with the book for sure. And it definitely became worse in the last two rules, which is unfortunate because, again, like I said, I like the last two rules quite a bit. So we already talked. So those are the 12 rules for life. Again, I'll go through them, just the names so that you can review them. It is stand up straight with your shoulders back. Treat yourself like somebody you are responsible for helping. Make friends with people who want the best for you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to someone else today. Don't let your children do anything that will make you dislike them. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. Be precise in your speech. Interesting that he talks about being precise in your speech, and then for the last two chapters, basically rambles. Don't bother children while they are skateboarding, and pet a cat when you encounter one in the street. So, also the last two names of I love how number 10 is be precise in your speech, and then number 11 and 12 are not precise at all. Don't bother children while they're skateboarding. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. Not precise at all. Sorry about that. Yeah. Just frustrated me that they weren't concise, because everything else was so concise, and I really, really liked the first half of the book, like a lot. And I liked the ideas of the second half of the book. I just felt like it just started to wander. Like he needed somebody in there like reeling him back the entire second half of the book. So as far as like critics of this, I read a lot of reviews on like Goodreads and Google and Amazon and different things like that. And there are people who absolutely love it. And then there are people like me who are like, yeah, super, super important, kind of confusing, super important though. And then there are a lot of people who just hate Jordan Peterson in general and would not like anything, even if he, if he just rewrote Karl Marx, they'd still be like, nope, not listening to him because his name's Jordan Peterson. And then there were a lot of people also who basically said that while a lot of what he said is good, none of it's proven because he doesn't quote a bunch of scientific studies in his book. And that last argument, I just don't like it. I don't like the idea that everything has to be proven through science when most of his book is just, it's a lot of stories, it's a lot of anecdotes, it's a lot of books, it's a lot of quotes, and it's basically his observation as an individual on what he believes makes a successful life and like will help you progress in life. And you don't have to prove that with science. I don't think so. One, science is science is constantly changing. So anybody who thinks that you can just prove everything with science and that's the end all be all, that's just baloney, because science is constantly changing and we're constantly learning new things and finding new ways to measure things, and that will continue forever. I don't think we are in the pinnacle of science right now. And to think that we are is just, it's very narrow-minded to think that nothing will ever change based on science that's discovered right now. So I think it's important that we also just learn through observations personally, too. And that, maybe some of what Jordan Peterson said is true and some of what he said maybe isn't true. And that's fine. Just take it for what it is and take the pieces of his book that you feel like you can apply to your life and maybe test them out in your own life and perform your own little scientific experiment of, does this make me a happier, better, more agreeable, more likable, overall just better individual, or does it not? And if it doesn't, then hey, try something else from the book and try it. But to just discredit everything that he wrote and say, not enough science, I think it's just the dumbest thing ever. Again, it doesn't have to have science. This is his opinion on everything. This is his view on the world. You can have your own view on the world and not back it up by science, but it could be backed up by your own personal observations, your own personal experiences. And then, as an individual, again, like everybody, like one of his rules say, assume that the person you are listening to might know something that you don't. Take something from the book and give it a try. Perform your own science experiment and whether or not it makes you a better individual, and then continue to grow and learn from there. But to automatically assume that Jordan Peterson has nothing to offer because his book wasn't, a giant peer review study from universities over and over and over about, blind studies of happiness based on whether or not you lie or don't lie. It's just dumb, right? Like, let's all agree. That's dumb. It's just dumb. It's just dumb. So that argument drove me nuts when I was reading it. But other than that, most people had a pretty positive experience with the book. I think it went over pretty well received. Again, probably the two largest camps were the people who were like over the moon about it. Like, this is the greatest thing ever. Everybody should read it. Should be mandatory reading. And then people with the camp that I fall into, which was, this was great. A lot of useful information, a lot of nuggets. I'd probably have to read this 5 or 6 times in order to really understand what he's saying. And he is a little bit confusing. And that's the kind of camp that I fall in. So overall, I would say this book is probably like a 3.5 for fun and a 5 for importance. 3.5 for fun, again, because it can be kind of confusing. I feel like I need to read it like 2 or 3 times. I found myself liking nuggets of each part a lot more than the whole because of how much he wanders and how much he just moves from topic to topic. So because of that, it's a little distracting. And so that's why I would give it a 3.5 for fun to read. However, 5 for importance. It's just about as important as it gets. The rules that he sets forth, I firmly believe are important for people. People need to learn these things. And if you're one of those people who's just like, nope, nothing to offer, then man, look at one of the rules that tell you that you shouldn't be like that. Because, maybe 100% of what he said isn't completely applicable, but I would be willing to bet the large portion is, and that it, that you can, these are pretty basic rules, and he just basically expounds on them and adds his own insight, his own experiences, as well as some of the insight and experiences of other people that he's read and listened to throughout history. So all in all, I think a really good read. I would recommend it, especially if you like self-help books. I'm slowly figuring out that I don't think I like self-help books. I thought honestly that would be one of my favorite genres when starting the Bookly podcast. I was like, I'm going to read a ton of business books and a ton of self-help books. And then I was making my list for next year, for 2024 of books, and I was like dreading every single self-help book that I put on my list. So I think I only ended up with like 2 all of next year, maybe 3. And maybe those 2 or 3 will kind of turn me around to them, but I just don't like them as much as I thought I would. I liked memoirs a lot more. And I think you can learn a lot of the same lessons from memoirs. And also, like, I don't know, I think you can learn a lot of the same lessons from literature as well. It's just not as easily spelled out, A, B, and C. You have to do a little bit of personalization and, a little bit of inferring and, I don't know, a little bit of deep dive emotional connections to the books. So, and maybe that's what I enjoy. Still trying to figure out what I actually enjoy. But overall, again, for me personally, not my favorite book that I've read this year, but definitely one of the more important books that I've read. And if you are somebody who really does like self-help books, maybe this is a 5 for you, because I have yet to find one that I really do like. So maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the problem. It's me. So a little Taylor Swift moment for you. So yeah, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I will be releasing the book order here shortly. So if you've gotten to the end of this episode, just know that the order of books for 2024 should be coming out shortly. I think I also added a link on my, like a link tree on my Instagram. So if you don't follow us on Instagram, follow me on Instagram at Bookly Podcast. And there is a link to be a guest on the podcast. So if you'd like to be a guest on the podcast for any of the books for the list that comes out for 2024, fill out the questionnaire and I'll get back to you and we can schedule a time to record an episode with you. I still am going to be looking for guests for every episode. I'm just not going to be as strict about it. If I don't have a guest, I don't have a guest. And people are just going to have to listen to me ramble, which from the feedback that I'm getting from people is not as cringy as I thought it was going to be. I thought people would hate listening to solo episodes from me, but I think people are enjoying it more than I thought, which is encouraging. So maybe we'll just keep it going a little bit and we'll have a few more solo episodes next year and just see if that's, holds true. And if it doesn't, then we'll put a little bit more of an effort into finding guests. I would still, like I said, love to have guests, but I just don't want it to stress me out as much as it has been stressing me out. I still want the Bookly podcast to be fun. And reading the books has been fun. Recording the episodes has been really fun. And kind of that reflection of each book has been really fun. The least fun part has been finding the guests and coordinating times and all that kind of stuff and having people, have conflicts and not be able to show up. Like it's just been a whole thing. So I'm, still working on it. Still would love to have people on as guests. We might try to do maybe a remote guest or two. We'll see how that goes, but definitely reach out. Let me know what you think. And thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you are still listening to this episode of the podcast, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. We don't get a whole lot of comments on YouTube. I'd like to get more comments on YouTube. I want people to be discussing the book. Add any questions that you had on this book. Maybe your thoughts that if you've read this book or your thoughts overall on Jordan Peterson. Maybe comment your favorite episode of Jordan Peterson's podcast or favorite guest that he's been on for another person's podcast. There's endless opportunities. Just comment something. Helps with the algorithm, helps more people see the podcast. And if you are on Apple or Spotify, make sure that you leave us a 5-star review. Those are starting to come in, which is nice. Again, we're starting to get more and more viewers on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, which is great. And it is also available anywhere else podcasts are available. And then follow us on Instagram. We are going to be shaking up with the Instagram here pretty soon. We've gotten a lot of feedback on things that people like, things that people don't like. And so we're going to be trying to create more content that people like and get a little bit more reels, get a little bit more fun, personal. So make sure to give us a follow. That's also where you'll get any sort of updates or anything that's going on. I know we also do like a giveaway every month for a free book. There's all sorts of stuff going on the Instagram. So make sure to give us a follow. That'd be awesome. And hope to see you next week on the Bookly podcast.